The room wasn't just quiet. It was composed, like a set piece awaiting a script it thought it had already read. Polished oak desks lined the hearing hall, microphones dormant, not yet lit. Spectators murmured in that delicate tone reserved for high-level political proceedings where decorum is both costume and weapon. Cameras were positioned but not rolling yet, and aides shuffled legal pads waiting for their moment to whisper. On the surface, everything felt ordinary. But under that sheen of order was something brittle, an edge no one could quite place. Karoline Leavitt stood alone near the chamber's south wall, reviewing her final notes not as a nervous gesture, but as ritual. She was composed, yes, but there was a storm building behind her eyes, something unspoken but unmistakable. She knew what she was about to do. She knew the weight of it, the target it would paint on her back, the alliances it might shatter. And still, she showed no hesitation. Because today wasn't about diplomacy. It wasn't about threading the political needle. It was about exposure. The committee session was titled innocuously enough, Ethical Governance and Federal Oversight. The kind of title designed to sound important without committing to anything. But Karoline hadn't come for vague frameworks. She had come for names, for actions, for truth with receipts. As she took her seat near the center microphone, she didn't look to her left or right. She didn't scan for allies, because the moment you start looking for applause in a room like this, you've already sold something. And Karoline wasn't here to be applauded. She was here to detonate. The gavel struck, a hollow wooden sound that barely registered above the anticipation. Chairman Bellman, a man so seasoned he practically breathed in subtext, welcomed everyone, with a thin smile and a voice that belonged more to country clubs than countrymen. He moved through the formalities quickly, as if eager to get on with the performance he assumed was coming, but Karoline was not here to perform. When her turn came, she didn't shuffle her papers. She didn't clear her throat. She simply adjusted the mic and began speaking, low, clear, unapologetic. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she said. "I've reviewed the minutes from the last 5 sessions of this committee. I've read every policy memo, every mission statement, every proposed resolution. And I'm here to say what no one else in this room has had the courage to." A ripple moved through the gallery. Not applause, awareness. Karoline's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The precision of her tone sliced through the posturing in the air like a scalpel. "This committee exists to ensure ethical governance," she said. "But instead of watchdogs, we've become a veil, a pretty curtain drawn over the machinery of influence, hiding everything we don't want the American people to see." Chairman Bellman blinked, visibly uncomfortable for the first time. Karoline continued. "We sit in these chambers and debate hypotheticals while real corruption blooms. In the soil of bureaucratic immunity, we pass ethics guidelines while turning a blind eye to contracts awarded to relatives, to backroom deals disguised as grant programs, to revolving doors between federal regulators and private lobbyists." Now the air shifted. Every aide in the room looked up. Several leaned in. "I'm not talking about generalizations," she said. "I'm talking about names. I'm talking about this committee allowing the Office of Public Infrastructure to award a $120 million contract to Pathwind Consultants, a firm co-owned by the cousin of director Janice Holloway, whose ethics disclosures conveniently omitted that relationship." The room froze. Chairman Bellman reached for his gavel but stopped. He didn't know what to do with it. Not yet. Karoline looked directly at him. "Did you know, Mr. Chairman? Because I have emails between your office and Holloway's scheduling team that suggest you met 4 times off record just before the Pathwind vote." The gallery was now dead silent, the kind of silence that's too deep to breathe in. Bellman's face began to redden, his lips parted slightly in shock, but Karoline didn't stop. "I'm not accusing anyone of miscommunication," she said. "I'm accusing them of deliberate misdirection. I'm accusing this body, this institution, of protecting its own reputation instead of protecting the taxpayers who fund every corrupt dollar funneled through these smoke and mirror procedures." The chairman tried to speak. "Ms. Leavitt, this is highly inappropriate." "No!" she snapped, her voice still controlled but now laced with fire. What's inappropriate is watching hard-earned American money siphoned into luxury office towers while rural towns can't fix their bridges. What's inappropriate is the word oversight being used to describe inaction. The entire room seemed to lean back at once, not recoiling, listening, actively, uneasily. She dropped a thick folder onto the desk before her. It echoed, loudly. This folder contains 217 pages of documentation, emails, financial records, travel reports, some of it obtained through FOIA, some leaked, all of it pointing to a web of influence this committee has either failed to uncover or, worse, refused to. Bellman opened his mouth again, but Karoline beat him to it. Do you want to see the Venmo logs, Mr. Chairman? Because I have them. $2,500 transfers between Pathwin executives and campaign consultants. In your district, logged, tracked, unexplained. And then she said the words that would reverberate far beyond the four walls of that room. I didn't come here to protect this committee's dignity. I came to prove it lost it a long time ago. Dead silence. The kind of silence that makes history. And Karoline Leavitt, sitting alone at that desk with fire in her voice and truth in her hands, didn't smile. Didn't blink, she just waited for the next move. Because for once, the room didn't belong to the powerful. It belonged to the one person willing to say what everyone else was too afraid to admit. No one moved. Not the chairman, not the aides. Not the lobbyists seated in the back row pretending to be interns. The sound in the chamber wasn't silence. It was stunned awareness. The audible absence of power reeling from a direct hit. Karoline Leavitt didn't lean back. She didn't sip water or look around for validation. She kept her eyes fixed on the chairman, her hands still resting on the folder like a judge waiting for the accused to speak. Bellman cleared his throat, a dry sound that barely made it through the mic. Ms. Leavitt, you understand these are serious allegations. If you continue down this road, they're not allegations. She interrupted, her voice firm but never raised. They're documented actions, financial transactions, meeting logs, undisclosed relationships. If you think I'd come in here with speculation, then you haven't been paying attention. A ripple of motion in the back, one of the aides whispered something to another, who stood quickly and exited through the side door. Karoline clocked it but didn't acknowledge it. They were already spinning, already calling in PR firepower. Legal shields, distraction campaigns. Let them. She hadn't lit the match to watch them run. She lit it to force the smoke into every corner of the building. Bellman's voice regained a fraction of its composure. We're not in the business of trial by accusation, Ms. Leavitt. We are still... She tilted her head slightly. This isn't a trial. Not yet. It's a reckoning, one that's long overdue, and every minute we pretend this room is above the law, we lose another inch of public trust. A man seated 3 chairs down, a senator who hadn't looked up once during her opening remarks, finally spoke. If you have credible evidence of criminal wrongdoing, then you know the appropriate channel is the Inspector General, not this. Committee? Karoline turned toward him, her expression steady. You mean the same Inspector General who has failed to open a single investigation in over a year? The same office whose budget was cut by members sitting in this room? I submitted this evidence 6 weeks ago. I received an automated reply and nothing else. Her words weren't loud, but they struck like hammer blows. I came here today because the system you've built has no interest in policing itself. Another voice, this one from a congresswoman known for her media polish. You're making it sound like the entire government is complicit. Karoline turned her gaze on her next target without a flicker of hesitation. I'm saying that complicity doesn't always wear a villain's mask. Sometimes it looks like apathy. Sometimes it looks like delayed reports and soft-spoken votes. Sometimes it looks like this, sitting in a circle watching the rot spread and nodding along while pretending the smell isn't real. A pause, then she opened the folder, slowly, deliberately. Page 12, she said, sliding a document toward the chairman. A procurement trail showing a contract rewritten 3 times in 2 days to bypass the ethics clause, signed by a junior deputy who received a new job title the day after. Bellman stared at the paper but didn't touch it. Karoline turned to the audience seated behind the railing, Citizens, journalists, policy interns pretending not to record. "You think this is rare?" she asked, her voice reaching them now. "It's not. I've traced similar fingerprints. In 7 departments: infrastructure, healthcare, transportation. The corruption isn't always dramatic. It's not cash in briefcases or private jets." She stood, the only one on her feet now. "It's quiet. It's procedural. It's death by 1,000 unchecked forms." She pointed to the document. "You all swore an oath. Not to a party, not to a policy, to the people. But for too long, that oath has been performed like a ceremony and not lived like a responsibility." Bellman finally spoke, his tone harsher now. "Ms. Leavitt, if you're accusing this committee of fraud—" "I'm not accusing," she snapped, her voice cutting clean through the veneer of civility. "I'm documenting." The chamber was no longer a room. It was a pressure cooker. You could feel the heat rise with every sentence. A few aides started shifting uncomfortably. 2 journalists began typing furiously. Someone in the audience coughed, and it sounded like thunder in the silence that followed. Karoline didn't sit. "I came here knowing I'd be dismissed, minimized, maybe even punished. I've read the rules. I know what happens when you challenge. The quiet status quo. But I don't fear that anymore. You know why?" She leaned slightly over the microphone. "Because I'd rather be punished for speaking the truth than rewarded for watching the lie." Her words echoed, not through the room, but through the faces. The chairman's mouth opened slightly. He was searching for the right procedural response, but there wasn't one. Parliamentary order didn't cover this. No script accounted for. Truth at full volume. Karoline slowly sat down, her hands once again resting on the folder. No applause, no outrage, just raw silence. A silence made not of shock, but of recognition. And across the country, the moment was already spreading. Live stream. Clips uploaded, headlines drafted, staffers pinged, and everywhere it landed, it carried one message. Karoline Leavitt hadn't just called out corruption. She had named it, and it had no idea how to answer. Karoline's words didn't end when she sat. They lingered, suspended in the air like gunpowder after ignition. They clung to the walls, to the microphones, to the marble floor beneath her desk. You could feel it, like the moment after a lightning strike, when you're still waiting to hear the thunder. Across the dais, committee members avoided her eyes, flipping through papers that suddenly seemed less like documents and more like shields. The chairman's aide whispered urgently into his ear, while another typed furiously on a tablet, already drafting the official response. Deny, discredit, reframe. But Karoline didn't look at them. Her gaze was locked forward, still, unshaken. She had done the unthinkable, not just breaking protocol, but breaking the pretense. One of the junior representatives, a first-term senator from Illinois, leaned in toward his mic. "Ms. Leavitt," he said carefully, "you mentioned you've traced similar activity across departments. Are you willing to submit that information in full to this committee?" She didn't hesitate. "Already have. It's in the sealed envelope. Delivered to your office at 8:42 this morning. Signed for by your chief of staff. Shall I read the confirmation number?" A pause. He blinked. "No, that won't be necessary." From the gallery, a rustle of movement. Journalists shifting for better views, a camera lens extending just slightly. Every angle, every blink, every breath was being watched now. Karoline had moved the hearing from a sleepy subcommittee formality to a live, unfolding event. Chairman Bellman found his voice again, but it was thinner now, too careful. "Ms. Leavitt, even if we take your findings seriously, which we will, of course, there are processes in place for this kind of review. This isn't the proper venue for accusatory spectacle." Karoline turned to him slowly. "You're right," she said softly. "It's not the proper venue." The room tensed. She stood again. But what happens when the proper venue is where the rot lives? What happens when you follow the protocol, file the reports, whisper through the right back channels, and nothing changes? What do you do then? She picked up the folder and held it aloft. "This isn't spectacle, it's a signal flare. And if this chamber is offended by the smoke, then maybe it should take a look at what's burning. Bellman was visibly agitated now. You're politicizing. This for attention. Karoline's reply came before he finished the sentence. I'm rescuing attention from the abyss you buried it in. Gasps. Literal gasps. The woman beside Bellman whispered something to him, but he waved her off. His voice rose, not with confidence, but with desperation. You're damaging this institution, Ms. Leavitt. No, she said calmly. I'm diagnosing it. A voice from the gallery shouted, Let her speak! Followed by a shuffling of feet and murmurs that turned into something harder to control. Bellman banged the gavel. This is a formal proceeding, he snapped. We will have order in this room. Karoline didn't flinch. She simply placed the folder back on the desk and tapped it once like a metronome. I didn't come here to blow a whistle, she said. I came to ring the alarm. She turned slowly to face the gallery. Because for years we've been told to wait, to let internal reviews work, to trust that change comes quietly, gradually, behind closed doors. But the truth is, it doesn't. Change doesn't happen until someone breaks the spell. She looked straight into the cameras now, not at the lawmakers, at the people. And if you've ever felt like your vote didn't matter, like your voice was swallowed by a system rigged in favor of itself, then you are not wrong. You are not paranoid, you are not ungrateful, you're just paying attention. Another gavel slam. That's enough. But the room didn't listen to him anymore. They were listening to her. Karoline's voice rose, not shouting, just rising, as if she could feel the moment expanding around her. Because this committee isn't broken by accident, it's broken by design. It's not a bug, it's the feature. And every time someone stands up to say this is wrong, they get buried under procedure, dismissed as extreme, or bribed into silence. She stepped forward, closer to the bench. Well, I don't need your silence. And I won't take your permission. Bellman stood now, red-faced, shouting something about decorum, but no one was watching him. Karoline didn't stop. I brought you receipts, but this is only the beginning. There are others, so many others, watching this. People on the inside, people who've had enough. I'm not the first to try this, but I'm going to be the first who doesn't stop when the cameras turn off. I finally sat down again. The silence that followed wasn't stunned, it was converted. There was no going back. Not for the room. Not for the people watching. Not for the chairman. And certainly not for Karoline Leavitt, because once you say the thing everyone's been thinking and prove it, you don't just change the conversation, you own it. And now, she did. The silence didn't fade, it deepened. It was no longer the awkward pause of politicians outmaneuvered. It was something colder, more dangerous, the stillness before consequences arrive. Karoline Leavitt had dropped a lit match in the center of a room soaked in political gasoline, and now every person seated behind those nameplates was realizing just how flammable their reputations had become. Chairman Bellman remained standing, his jaw clenched, face pulsing with a slow, steady fury he couldn't disguise. But what made it worse, what humiliated him, was that there was nothing he could say. Not yet. Not when the room was still digesting the truths that had just been spoken so plainly, so calmly, and so undeniably. And Karoline, she sat with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from pride, it comes from certainty. Her breathing was slow, her hands folded neatly on the folder she'd cracked open like a vault. She didn't need to say anything else, because they were saying it for her now, not with words. With fear. One of the senior committee members, a man with 40 years of procedural weight under his belt, finally leaned into his mic, his voice measured but shaking just beneath the surface. Ms. Leavitt, these are grave assertions. If you have indeed provided this committee with substantiated evidence of misconduct, then it is our duty to review it, through the proper channels. Karoline looked at him, her eyes hard but not cruel. You've had the evidence for weeks. And I don't recall anyone requesting a single follow-up. Not one clarification, not one subpoena, not one question. He opened his mouth. then closed it. That was the difference. That's what was different about her. She wasn't asking them to investigate. She was shaming them for not having done it already. The woman seated next to the chairman, Congresswoman Raines, a known ally of corporate infrastructure donors, adjusted her earpiece and leaned forward. This chamber is not a courtroom, Ms. Leavitt. You are not judge, jury, and executioner. Karoline turned slowly, deliberately. No, she said. But I am the witness. The one who saw the documents, the one who traced the connections, the one who followed the money when your ethics subcommittee looked the other way. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence was crowded. It was filled with the unspoken scramble of political calculus. Who had taken what? Who had signed off? Who was mentioned by name in that thick folder, and how fast could they scrub their involvement before the press got hold of it? Karoline tapped the folder once more. This is just the beginning, she said. What's in here is the tip of a much larger pattern. Ghost companies, recycled contracts, shell bids designed to fail so the preferred bidder gets the award. It's happening not just in Washington, but in state offices, city councils, school boards. It's a culture. And you all helped build it by letting the soft rot in. Chairman Bellman slammed his gavel down again, harder this time, as if volume could erase meaning. This is out of order. Karoline looked at him for the first time in several minutes. She tilted her head slightly, the faintest expression of contempt tightening the corners of her mouth. So is taking public funds to enrich your donors. But here we are. Someone in the gallery laughed, quickly stifled, but not before it bounced off the back wall. It wasn't mockery, it was recognition. It was the sound of someone hearing truth spoken in a building that had forgotten what it sounded like. Bellman's hands trembled slightly as he fumbled for the next procedural deflection. We'll recess briefly while the committee reviews. But he was cut off by the sound of another committee member standing abruptly. It was Senator Doyle, known for keeping his mouth shut and his voting record neutral. He was rarely quoted, rarely seen on camera. But now he was standing. He cleared his throat and said, I want to see the full report, today, in front of this committee, in front of the press. Gasps again. Raines turned to him sharply. Senator, that's what the American people deserve, he interrupted. I'm tired of rubber-stamping ethics reviews and pretending we're not complicit in our own decay. Karoline didn't speak. She didn't need to, because the room was tilting. The illusion of order, of unity, of institutional immunity. It was fracturing, publicly and in real time. Within seconds, half the aides in the room were on their phones, heads down, typing furiously. Some were emailing reporters, some were checking internal memos, a few were panicking, because they knew that what had just happened couldn't be buried. Karoline turned back to the chairman, her voice quieter now. Not soft, just final. You wanted to wait for the right forum, for the right time, for the proper process. That time is now. This is the forum, the cameras are rolling, the public is watching. She leaned in. So go ahead, recess if you want. Delay, deflect. But know this, every minute you waste is another minute people realize that the most dangerous thing in this room isn't corruption. She paused. It's your silence. The gavel stayed raised. But it didn't come down. Because for the first time in his career, Chairman Bellman didn't know what to do. And Karoline Leavitt, she wasn't afraid of that silence. She had built her voice for it. The fifth act didn't begin with words. It began with movement. Small, silent, unmistakable. The gavel remained frozen in the chairman's hand, suspended mid-air like it was waiting for orders from a world that no longer recognized its authority. Around the table, senators exchanged glances that weren't just nervous, they were calculating. Karoline Leavitt sat still at the center of it all, unmoving, untouched, as if she were no longer part of the room but the axis it now revolved around. What had begun as a hearing had become something else entirely. Not theater, not rebellion, but revelation. Chairman Bellman, still standing, slowly lowered the gavel without using it. He adjusted his tie with trembling fingers, eyes scanning the audience, then the cameras, then the folder in front of Karoline like it might grow teeth. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. Ms. Leavitt, if what you've presented is accurate, you understand the implications. Her voice was even. Yes, I do. You're accusing sitting members of this committee, federal departments, named officials. You're jeopardizing your career, possibly your safety. I'm not here to be safe, she replied. I'm here to end the illusion that silence is stability. The words hit like a thunderclap. Behind her, someone in the gallery clapped once, reflexively, impulsively, and was immediately hushed. But the sound landed, undeniable and raw. Bellman exhaled, long and ragged. Then for the record, he said, as if trying to regain his authority, this committee will recess for 30 minutes while we review this material. No, Karoline said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was absolute. No more recesses. No more reviews in back rooms while press releases are drafted. I've just done the thing you've all spent years pretending to do. The public doesn't need your summary. They need this. She placed her hand firmly on the folder. Unfiltered, unedited, unprotected. Chairman Bellman flinched, not visibly, but in the way people do when they realize they're not in control anymore. Very well, came another voice, Senator Doyle again. Let's read it, right now. Let's enter it into the record, page by page. If we're going to stand for ethics, let's do it in the light. A quiet murmur rose through the gallery. The press pool leaned forward. One camera operator whispered, "Keep rolling," to a second. The entire room was coming alive, not with chaos, but with a strange and electric sense of awakening. Karoline opened the folder. She began to read. She didn't rush. She didn't dramatize. She simply read the truth, the raw detail of what had been ignored. She read emails between directors and campaign bundlers, time-stamped messages coordinating no-bid contracts, flight logs showing government officials attending private retreats paid for by shell corporations that didn't exist 6 months before. She read about money that had changed hands on quiet weekends, about amendments slipped into 400-page bills at 2:00 a.m., about whistleblowers fired and silenced under the name of security clearance. She read names, and for the first time, some of those names belonged to people in the room. You could feel it, like watching glass crack under pressure. Some members stared at their desks. One asked to be excused. Another left quietly, whispering into their phone. But Karoline didn't stop. Her voice remained steady, like a scalpel carving away everything they'd built to protect themselves. 30 minutes passed, then 40. Still she read. Senator Raines eventually tried to interrupt. Ms. Leavitt, some of this information may not be admissible. You're using documents that haven't been formally authenticated. They've already been verified, Karoline said, by the Department of Legislative Ethics, filed under Case Code 61B. I have the time-stamped chain of custody in Appendix B. Raines said nothing more. Karoline continued. She read until her voice began to dry, until her hand began to shake slightly from holding the heavy pages, until even she began to feel the weight of how much had been ignored, how much had been allowed to grow in the dark like mold behind wallpaper. Then finally she set the last page down. Silence again. Not disbelief, not doubt, but knowing. Chairman. Bellman slowly leaned forward, voice hoarse. We'll need to reconvene. Tomorrow. With legal counsel. With federal oversight. No, Karoline said again softly. You don't need oversight. You need integrity. And if you can't find it, I will. She stood. I'm sending this report to every member of the press within the hour. I'm forwarding it to every ethics officer in the Capitol. I'm giving the public what you wouldn't. Bellman stared at her like a man watching the walls of his world shift. You'll regret this, he muttered. She looked at him, steady. I hope so, she said, because that means it mattered. Then, without waiting for a response, Karoline Leavitt walked out, past the committee, past the guards, past the stunned aides and whispered panic. She walked into the light of the hallway as flashes erupted around her. Questions were shouted. Names were called. But she didn't stop. Because when you tell the truth and burn the bridge behind you, there's only one direction left to walk. Forward. And she was just getting started. The echo of her footsteps carried farther than she did. Karoline Leavitt didn't just leave the committee chamber, she left behind a crater. The hearing room that once thrived on manufactured civility, choreographed discourse, and tightly leashed dissent was now changed. Permanently. In the hallway, journalists surged like a tide finally released. Microphones extended toward her face, flashbulbs sparked like lightning. Shouts filled the air, colliding over each other. Karoline, do you have confirmation that Bellman's office took contributions from Pathwin? Who else is named in the report? Are you accusing this administration of federal-level racketeering? Do you have whistleblowers prepared to testify? She didn't stop walking. She didn't raise her voice. She simply handed a single manila envelope to the nearest journalist. Then another. The report. All of it. No embargo, no exclusives, no conditions. This belongs to the people now, she said. One reporter tried to keep up, asking, breathlessly, "Do you realize what you've just done?" Karoline paused just for a second and turned to face the sea of cameras and chaos. "I didn't expose corruption," she said. "I exposed its protection, and now it's on all of you. What happens next depends on who's willing to stop pretending the truth is a matter of opinion." Then she was gone. Not into a limousine, not into a private elevator. She walked into the street, coat unbuttoned, wind rising against her as her phone began to vibrate in sharp bursts. Calls from allies, threats from enemies, warnings from people who'd once offered her polite smiles and now only had one word for what she'd become. Dangerous. By nightfall, the report was everywhere. Every major outlet, every independent journalist. Screens lit up with terms the public had grown numb to. Fraud. Contract manipulation. Ethics violations. But this time, it wasn't abstract. It had names. It had dates. It had proof. And it had her voice, embedded in the recording of the hearing that now trended across every platform. Leavitt effect, Karoline exposes, corruption, dirt not just, the system trending, spiraling, surging. Within 24 hours, calls for an emergency ethics investigation were echoed by both parties. Bellman's office denied all allegations, but his staff had already begun shredding old paper, deleting burner inboxes, locking doors they used to leave open. Senator Raines canceled 3 fundraisers. 2 aides from the Office of Public Infrastructure resigned before sunrise. Whistleblower hotlines received more calls than in the last 6 months combined. And Karoline? She didn't appear on a talk show. She didn't go live. She didn't even tweet. She watched. She waited, because she knew what the next phase required wasn't a victory lap. It was a follow-through. In a quiet apartment, her lights low, screens open around her, she built the second folder. The bigger one. The one that had taken months to piece together. This one didn't just touch a committee. It stretched into 3 agencies, 5 private corporations, 2 political action committees, and 1 federal judge. She'd named the first file Smoke. This one, she labeled it Ashes, because Karoline Leavitt wasn't a whistleblower. She wasn't a rebel. She wasn't even a politician anymore. Not really. She was a reckoning, and the fire had only just begun. Because once a voice dares to call out power, it echoes through every wall they tried to build to keep it out. And if that voice refuses to be silenced, it doesn't just change the room, it rewrites the rules.